Misa. So today I'm going to continue with my Grimm's fairytale series, and I'm going to be reading Hans my Hedgehog, or Hans, however you want to pronounce it. I skimmed the first two sentences, and I'm getting the impression of that we're going to have like a werewolf situation about a half hedgehog boy. I'm kind of getting Witcher vibes. If you've seen it, you know what I mean, that one guy who's cursed to look like a hedgehog. But let's just jump into it. Long ago, there was a farmer who had quite enough money and property to live upon. But rich as he was, he lacked one piece of fortune. He had no children. Many times when he went to the market, the other farmers would laugh at him and question his lack of offspring. At last, he flew into a rage, and he came home and exclaimed, "I will have a child, even if it should be a hedgehog!" Soon after this speech, his wife gave birth to a child that was like a hedgehog above and a boy below. And when his wife saw it, she was frightened. She said, "See that you have cursed us." The farmer replied, "It cannot be helped now. We must have it christened, although it will have no godfather." And the wife said, "We can call it nothing else but Hans my Hedgehog." And when it was christened, the priest said, "With its spikes, it cannot sleep in a common bed." So a pile of straw was laid behind the stove for Hans my Hedgehog to lie upon. There he stayed for 8 years until his father grew tired of him and wished he would die. Side note, I'm just wondering why she named it Hans my Hedgehog. Like, that's his name. Every time he's referred to, that's his whole name is Hans my Hedgehog. Not just Hans. But Hans my Hedgehog did not die and stayed in the same spot. And one day the farmer was on his way to a fair in a neighboring town. He asked his wife what he should bring home, and she told him, "A little piece of meat, some rolls of bread, some things for housekeeping." Then he went to the maid, who wanted some slippers and a pair of stockings. Lastly, he went to Hans my Hedgehog, who replied, "Father, bring me some bagpipes." When the farmer returned home, he brought his wife the meat and the bread, and the maid the slippers and the stockings. And finally, he went behind the oven and gave Hans my Hedgehog the bagpipes. As soon as Hans my Hedgehog had the pipes in hand, he said, "Father, go to the blacksmith and have him shoe the rooster. I will ride it away and never return." Now, is he talking about riding the rooster, like putting horseshoes on the rooster? Because that'll be very interesting. The father was glad to be rid of him and had the rooster shod. As soon as that was done, Hans my Hedgehog sat upon it and rode away, taking with him pigs and donkeys, which he meant to tend in the forest. In the forest, Hans my Hedgehog spurred the rooster to the top of the highest tree, and he sat there and tended to the pigs and the donkeys for many years until there were lots of pigs and donkeys. All this time, his father knew nothing of him. While Hans my Hedgehog sat on the treetop, he played his bagpipes and made beautiful music. Once, a king who had lost his way in the forest came riding past and chanced to hear him. He wondered at the sound and sent his servant to see where it came from. The servant looked about, but saw only a little animal upon a tree. It seemed to be a rooster with a hedgehog on its back that made the music. The king told the servant to ask why it sat there, and if it knew which road led to his kingdom. Side note, what if the king has to kiss Hans, and then Hans will be turned into a human? Classic? So Hans my Hedgehog got down from the tree, and he said he would show him the way if, in return, the king would write a note that promised to give Hans my Hedgehog whatever first came across the king when he arrived home. The king thought, "I can easily do that, for Hans my Hedgehog cannot read, and I can write what I like." So the king took pen and ink and wrote a note, and that done, Hans my Hedgehog showed him the way, and he got safely home. But his daughter saw the king arriving from afar, and he was so overjoyed that she ran to meet and kiss him. The king remembered Hans my Hedgehog and said that he had been forced to promise whatsoever first greeted him when he got home to a very strange animal that sat on a rooster as if it were a horse and made beautiful music. But then the king said that he had written instead that he should not receive it, because Hans my Hedgehog could not read anyway. The princess was pleased and said he had done well, for she would have never gone away with it. Hans my Hedgehog, however, looked after his donkeys and pigs and was always happy and sat on the tree and played his bagpipes. It happened that another king came by with his servants, and he had lost his way as well, but did not know his way home because it was a large forest. He also heard the beautiful music and sent his servant to find where it came from. The servant went to the tree, saw the rooster sitting at the top of it and Hans my Hedgehog atop the rooster, and asked what he was doing there. "I am keeping my donkeys and my pigs, but how can I help you?" Hans my Hedgehog replied. The servant explained that they were lost and they could not get back to their own kingdom, and asked if he would not show them the way. So Hans my Hedgehog got down from the tree and told the king that he would show them the way if, in return, the king would write a note that promised to give Hans my Hedgehog whatever first came across the king when he arrived home. The king said, "Yes," and wrote a promise to Hans my Hedgehog that he should have this. That done, Hans my Hedgehog rode before him on the rooster and pointed out the way, and the king reached his kingdom again safely. When he reached the palace, there was great rejoicing. This king had an only daughter who was very beautiful. She ran to meet him, threw her arms around his neck, and delighted to have her old father back again. She kissed him. She also asked where in the world he had been for so long. So the king told her how he'd lost his way and had very nearly not come back at all. But as he was traveling through a great forest, a strange animal that sat on a rooster as if it were a horse and made music had shown him the way home. The king added that in return he had promised whatsoever first greeted him in the royal courtyard, and how that was she herself. And that made the king very sad. But she promised that, for love of her father, she would willingly go with this Hans my Hedgehog if he arrived to claim her. Hans my Hedgehog, however, took care of his pigs, and they became more pigs, and then more pigs, until there were so many that the whole forest was filled with pigs. Then Hans my Hedgehog sent word to his father to have every sty in the village emptied, for he was coming with such a great herd of pigs that anyone who could butcher should do so. His father was troubled at hearing this, for he thought Hans my Hedgehog had died long ago. Hans my Hedgehog, however, seated himself on the rooster and drove the pigs before him into the village and ordered the slaughter to begin. Oh, then there was butchering and hacking that could be heard 2 hours away, and when it was done, Hans my Hedgehog said, "Father, have the rooster shod once more at the forge, and I will ride away and never return." The father had the rooster shod once more, and was pleased that Hans my Hedgehog would never return again. Side note, the father is pretty ungrateful. It sounds like they made a lot of money off of this whole pig scheme. Hans my Hedgehog rode away to the first kingdom, where the king had commanded that anyone who came riding on a rooster and carrying bagpipes should be shot at, stabbed, and butchered so that he might not enter the castle. When therefore Hans my Hedgehog came riding, the king's guards attacked him with bayonets, but he spurred the rooster, and it flew up over the gates into the king's window and lighted there. Hans my Hedgehog demanded that he be given what was promised, or he would take both the king's life and that of his daughter. Side note, Hans sounds horrible. Not only is he a half hedgehog, he's very violent and has anger issues. And he butchered like hundreds of pigs. Kind of weird. He's a hedgehog. Isn't that like the same family? Anyways, then the king begged his daughter to go away with Hans my Hedgehog in order to save both of their lives. So the princess dressed herself in white, and her father gave her a carriage with 6 horses, magnificent attendees, great gold, and treasures. She seated herself in the carriage and placed Hans my Hedgehog beside her with the rooster and the bagpipes. And when they drove away, the king thought he would never see his daughter again. But things would turn out differently than he thought, For when he were a short distance from the castle, Hans my Hedgehog tore her pretty clothes off and pierced her with his hedgehog spikes until she was bloodied. Oh my god. That is the reward for your falseness, he said. Go away, I will not have you. And he chased her home again, where she lived in disgrace for the rest of her days. Why is she disgraced? Like, Hans is horrible. Everyone should be glad she's back home. Hans my Hedgehog, however, rode farther on the rooster, carrying his bagpipes to the land of the second king, to whom he had also shown the way. This king had proclaimed that if anyone like Hans my Hedgehog should come, his guards were to present arms, salute him, and give him safe conduct. When the king's daughter saw Hans my Hedgehog, she was horrified, for he really looked strange. But she could do nothing, for she had given her promise to her father. So Hans my Hedgehog was welcomed by her, and seated at the royal table with the princess by his side. When the evening came and it was time to go to bed, she was afraid of his spikes, but he told her not to fear, for no harm would come to her. Hans my Hedgehog asked the old king to place 4 guards by the door of the chamber and have them light a great fire. When Hans my Hedgehog was about to get into bed, he would creep out of his hedgehog skin and leave it lying on the bedside, and the men were to run quickly to it, throw it in the fire, and stay by it until it was consumed. When the clock struck 11, Hans entered the chamber, stripped off the hedgehog skin, and left it lying on the bedside. Then came the guards, who fetched it swiftly and threw it in the fire. When the fire had consumed his hedgehog skin, Hans was saved. He lay on the bed and had the shape of a man, but his skin was charred as if he had been burned. The king sent for his physician, who bathed him in ointments and balms, so his skin returned to normal, and he was a handsome young gentleman. When the king's daughter saw that, she was glad, and the next morning they woke up joyfully and were married. Hans received the kingdom from his wife's aged father. When several years had passed, Hans brought his wife to visit his father, introducing himself as his son. The father declared that he had never had but one who had been born like a hedgehog with spikes.
Surprise, bitch. I bet you thought you'd seen the last of me.
Then Hans made himself known, and the father rejoiced, and returned with his son to the kingdom. The end. Okay, a few things to unpack here. Did they mention that he only turns into a hedgehog at night? Because I might have blacked out as I was reading and missed that part, but it seems like he could have had this whole plan a lot sooner in his life if he was just going to end up throwing his skin in the fire at 11 o'clock. I'm sure his parents could have done that. Also, he just goes back to his father. Guy, he sent you out into the wilderness. He hated you. And they don't say anything about the mother. Did she also go back to the kingdom? Also, there are some parallels with The Witcher, like the hedgehog curse, the child of surprise, where as a favor you get the first thing that someone sees when they go home. They very much use these parts. But yeah. Anyways, I'm going to be reading more stories next week, so tune in if you want. Thanks.
I was cursed as a young boy. My whole life a living misery until the day that I saved your husband, King Ragnar, from a certain death. By tradition, I chose the law of surprise as payment. Whatever windfall he came home to find would be mine.